Virgo, there's something that may have been building in someone's interior for longer than they've let on. A pull, a specific, persistent, increasingly difficult to rationalize pull in your direction, not the casual kind that arrives lightly and dissipates just as easily. Something with more weight to it than that. Something that may have started quietly, almost imperceptibly, and then grew, without asking permission, into something that now occupies more of their interior landscape than they were prepared for. And what may be happening right now in the private, unwitnessed space of their own experience is a kind of reckoning with that. A confrontation with the fact that what they feel for you has exceeded whatever container they originally thought would hold it. That the distance they may have tried to maintain for whatever reason, practical or protective, or simply because they weren't sure what to do with the intensity of it, is no longer as sustainable as it once seemed. Something may be shifting in how they're choosing to move. Let's begin at the beginning with what attraction of this particular quality actually feels like from the inside. Because not all attraction is created equal. There's the kind that lives comfortably on the surface, pleasant, manageable, something you can pick up and put down without it leaving much of a mark. You enjoy someone's company, you find them appealing, you might think about them occasionally and then not think about them, and the balance between the two feels easy, unremarkable, well within the range of things you can direct with your own will. And then there's the other kind, the kind that doesn't respond to direction, the kind that surfaces without invitation in the middle of an unrelated task, in the gap between one thought and the next, in the strange suspended moment before sleep when the mind releases its grip on the managed version of your interior and whatever is actually present simply rises. The kind that has a specificity to it, not a generalized longing for connection or company, but something aimed, pointed, directed at one particular person with a precision that doesn't feel chosen so much as discovered. This may be what's been happening for them. An attraction that arrived with more force than expected, and then, instead of softening with time, as attraction sometimes does when it isn't fed, deepened, became more specific, developed texture and detail and a quality of knowing that made it harder, not easier, to set aside. You may have become, in their interior world, something they didn't entirely plan for. There's something about you, something specific and real that may have produced this. And I want to talk about that because it matters. Because sometimes we receive information about how someone feels and immediately begin attributing it to luck or circumstance or some quality of timing rather than to anything essential about who we actually are. As if being genuinely, deeply attractive to someone is a thing that happened to us rather than a thing that emerged from us. But attraction of this intensity isn't random. It attaches to something. It finds its anchor in specific qualities, in the way a person moves through the world, in the texture of how they think, in the particular combination of strength and vulnerability that makes someone feel simultaneously compelling and trustworthy, in the way they hold themselves in difficult moments, in the quiet evidence of their character that accumulates over time and eventually becomes impossible to look away from. Something about you may have done exactly that. Become impossible to look away from, not through any performance or strategy, not through the management of an image or the careful presentation of your most appealing qualities, but through the simpler, more powerful act of being genuinely yourself in this person's presence, of allowing them to witness something real, something that didn't ask for their approval before it showed up, and finding that what they witnessed moved something in them that they hadn't been expecting to have moved. That's not something that happens with everyone. And the fact that it happened with you, that you produced this quality of response in this particular person, says something about what you carry, about the specific kind of presence you have, about what becomes visible in you when you're not trying to be anything other than what you are. Now let's talk about why they may have hesitated. Because the gap between feeling something with this kind of intensity and moving toward it isn't always as simple as it looks from the outside. Intense attraction, paradoxically, can produce its own form of paralysis, can create a hesitation that has nothing to do with indifference and everything to do with the weight of what's being felt. When something matters this much, the stakes of getting it wrong feel correspondingly higher. There may have been a period, perhaps one you lived through, without fully understanding what was happening, where this person's behavior seemed inconsistent in ways that were confusing, present and then absent, warm and then careful, reaching toward you and then pulling back in a way that may have felt from your side like uncertainty about you, when in fact it may have been uncertainty about themselves, about how to hold something this significant without damaging it, about whether they were ready to be seen in the vulnerability of wanting something this specifically and this much. Fear and desire often arrive together. And for some people, particularly those who have learned through their own history with love and disappointment, to be cautious about how much they reveal of themselves before they're certain, the experience of overwhelming attraction can feel less like a gift and more like an exposure they didn't ask for. A sudden visibility of their own interior that requires adjustment before it can be offered outward. They may have needed time to adjust, to become internally someone who could move toward you without retreating, to let what they feel settle from overwhelming into simply true, from something that destabilized them into something they could carry with a degree of steadiness, to reach the point where the fear of moving towards you became finally and definitively smaller than the fear of not doing so. Something may suggest they've reached that point or are very close to it. There's an energy in this reading that feels less like someone still in the middle of their own interior negotiation and more like someone who has come through the other side of it, who has done whatever private reckoning was required and arrived somewhere that feels, if not entirely comfortable, at least decided. Decided is different from comfortable. Decided means the analysis is complete and the conclusion has been reached, even if the execution still requires a form of courage that doesn't arrive fully formed. It means the question of whether has been settled, and what remains is only the question of how and when, which are very different questions with very different energies attached to them. The energy of how and when tends to move differently than the energy of whether. It has a forward quality to it, a momentum that once it begins tends to continue because the decision behind it is no longer in question. Because the most difficult part, the internal part, the part no one else could do for them, has already been completed in the privacy of their own experience. And what's left is simply to let what's already true on the inside become visible on the outside. That visibility may be approaching Let's turn toward what this might mean for you and what you might want to consider about your own interior before this arrives. Because you have a history with this dynamic, with the experience of being wanted or of sensing that someone wants you and navigating the complicated interior territory that tends to produce the part of you that responds to genuine desire with warmth, the part that remains cautious regardless, the part that has learned through whatever your own specific journey with love has involved to hold a certain amount of space between what you feel and what you show, not out of dishonesty, but out of a kind of hard won self protection that developed for real reasons. All of that is part of what you bring to this moment. And there may be a question worth sitting with quietly, without pressure, simply as an honest inquiry into your own experience about what you actually want from this person, not what would be reasonable to want, not what makes sense given the history or the circumstances or the complicated shape of whatever has existed between you until now. What do you actually want? When you strip away the analysis and the caution and the very legitimate reasons for uncertainty, when you get down to the part of you that exists before all of that protective architecture, what is there? What does that part lean toward when it's not being managed? What does it recognize in this person that makes them different from others who have occupied the periphery of your life without this particular quality of weight? That recognition may be information worth honoring, not as a directive, not as something that obligates you to any particular response when what's coming finally arrives, but as an honest piece of your own interior that deserves to be acknowledged to yourself at minimum before you're asked to respond to something real from the outside. There's something about the particular quality of being pursued, genuinely pursued, by someone whose attraction has the texture of something real rather than something convenient that deserves to be felt fully rather than immediately processed. Because there's a difference between being wanted and being seen. Being wanted is common enough. People want things for all kinds of reasons: comfort, habit, loneliness, the appeal of what someone represents rather than who they actually are. That kind of wanting tends to have a generalized quality to it. It could, in many cases, attach to someone else without losing much in the transfer. But being seen, being the specific object of someone's attention in a way that demonstrates genuine knowledge of who you are, genuine recognition of your particular qualities, genuine attraction to the actual you rather than a convenient approximation of you that's rarer. And what the energy of this reading suggests is that the latter may be what's approaching, not someone pursuing an idea of you, someone pursuing you, the specific, complicated, occasionally difficult, genuinely remarkable actual person that you are. Someone whose attraction has had enough time and enough proximity to develop beyond the surface and attach itself to something more essential, something that persists not in spite of knowing you better, but because of it. That kind of pursuit asks something different of you than the other kind. It asks you to receive it as the real thing. It may be not to minimize it, not to immediately search for the catch, not to protect yourself so completely from the possibility of it being true that you inadvertently closed the door on something that was actually genuinely worth opening to. Here is what may be unfolding in the days ahead. a closing of distance, not necessarily dramatic, not necessarily announced in advance or arriving with the weight and ceremony that the internal significance of it might seem to warrant. More likely in the texture of ordinary interaction, a moment that extends slightly longer than it needed to, a conversation that moves into territory neither of you has quite navigated before, a gesture or a look or a quality of presence that makes something visible that has until now been kept carefully out of sight, or perhaps more directly than that, perhaps an actual declaration in whatever form it takes when this particular person, with their particular way of moving through the world, finally decides to let what they feel be known. Perhaps a reaching across whatever gap has existed between where you are and where they've been standing for longer than you may have realized, holding something, waiting for the moment when the holding became less possible than the offering. That moment may be very close now. And whatever form it takes, grand or quiet, expected or surprising, arriving exactly when you thought it might, or catching you completely off guard in the middle of something entirely ordinary, the invitation is simply to be present for it, to let yourself be in it without immediately leaving it for the safety of analysis, to give yourself and them the experience of a moment that's allowed to be what it is before it's decided what it means. As this reading moves toward its close, here is what feels most essential to leave with you. You have produced something real in someone, not through strategy, not through performance, through the genuine, irreducible, specific fact of who you are, the way you move, the way you think, the way you show up in the world, with whatever particular combination of qualities makes you undeniably, unrepeatably yourself. That produced an overwhelming attraction in a person who may not be easily overwhelmed. And that person, after whatever private journey brought them to this point, through whatever fear and hesitation and internal reckoning, the intensity of what they feel required may be moving toward you now with a quality of intention that has been earned rather than simply felt. That has been tested against doubt and found on the other side of the testing still true. Still aimed at you, still specific, still real, still carrying beneath whatever words it arrives in the weight of something that has been held carefully and honestly for long enough that offering it now is not an impulse but a decision. You deserve to receive that fully, not from